See that noise I hear first, guys? So this video and this review for you guys is for Unit 1 for AP Government. This does not cover everything in Unit 1, but just what you need to know for this week's assessment, right? So by the time you take the Unit 1, or I should say the final AP exam in the spring, you'll want to know some more of this from Unit 1, but this is the foundation of what we need to know right now. So as I said earlier, the practice questions is actually harder than what you'll take, because that included some of the other things from Unit 1 that you should know, like some of the court cases and things like that as well. All right. So there's a couple of documents we should know by now. And the first one is Articles of Confederation. We spent a lot of time working on that just to know what are the reasons why it did not work, right? The only thing the AP people will really ever want you to know, even though there's a lot more cool and interesting stuff about it, is why it didn't work. And I like to always say that even though we always give it a bad rap, it had a very specific purpose and a place and time. It is very doubtful that after the revolution, we would have gone straight to something like the Constitution. So this was like an important placeholder. But why wasn't it working? What are some of the reasons why it didn't work? You can tell me. Go ahead. Okay, yeah, there's no way to really officially collect taxes, and so you couldn't get money. You couldn't, during the revolution, a lot of the troops didn't have weapons, they didn't have shirts, right? There was no way to get money. What else couldn't it do? Go ahead. There you go. Trade was an issue, especially even between states, right? What else? Go ahead. Yeah, you had states not happy with each other, definitely, and they had no real power to do anything about it. Couldn't establish an army, right? They could say, like, please send us your troops. Please send us some state militias. Pretty please, right? You couldn't call up the way you can under the Constitution. And one thing I like to point out is, if you read the Articles of Confederation, they actually use the words that this is a league of friendship. So is this really a treaty? Or is it really a constitution, a government? Right? It's more of a treaty, a league of friendship, right? Can you always guarantee that your friends are going to be your friends? Right? We like to think so, but do friends have problems? Sure, and sometimes it's hard to work those things out. So I know we lost Matthew Perry this week. Everyone's heartbroken. So when you think of, friends, and you think of the issues between states, some of the silly issues that they had, right? They weren't a government, right? They were friends, and they had problems, and who was there to make sure things were going better. So just may help you remember. All right, so that's one document you want to know. And before we get to the Constitution, right, we do have the Declaration, and you do want to know some of those philosophies that we spent time on, especially those of Locke, right? The social contract, right? There was an agreement amongst the people that we're going to have to give up some of our liberties in order for the government to protect our natural rights. Right? Natural rights come from God, they come from nature, they come from the fact that we have the ability to reason. Government does not give you your rights, right? But they're there to protect them. And remember, the social contract is also like, it's not an official contract. You're not born going, hey, you're going to agree to this system you live into? Here, sign away, right? But it's something that through the events that the people just agree to. So the framers of the Constitution were influenced by Locke and other Enlightenment ideas, and they framed the Constitution with this, the idea that we're appealing to popular sovereignty, that the people were really those in charge here, right? There was no divine right of kings, right? There was an executive who had the last word. It was the people through the Constitution. So when it comes to the Constitution, this is what we're going to dissect all year, right? But this unit gives us the basics. So it increased the power of the central government. That's a key part to federalism. Because remember, under the Articles, there really was no central government. There was, but what was the only branch under the Articles? Congress, right? Only a legislative branch, right? And why a lot of people didn't want the Constitution is because they didn't like this increase in power, right? They didn't like that states were giving up some of its rights to this government. The Constitution created a bicameral legislature. What does that mean? Bicameral. Go ahead. Two houses, excellent, right? So we have the House and the Senate. Oh no, my battery's going to die. And that came about. There were many compromises at the Constitutional Convention, and we have the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, from our buddy Roger Sherman, right? So what did that decide? What was the Great Compromise? It's basically just what is our Congress now, right? How would the Senate be decided? Right, so the Senate would be equal per state, 2 per state, and the House would be based on population, right? There's lots of different clauses in the Constitution. 2 to know for now. The necessary and proper clause. That is a clause also known as, and the supremacy clause. Those are both clauses that made the anti-federalists, made the people who were upset with the Constitution, people like Brutus, right, worried. Because if, like you said, well, what powers do they have? Well, if it's necessary and proper. Can you convince someone that almost anything is necessary and proper? Right? If you're good at your rhetoric, quite possibly. And the supremacy clause being that, like, the Constitution is like the one that takes charge, right? If your state law contradicts it, too bad. The Constitution reigns supreme. Another reason why some of the anti-federalists were afraid of the Constitution. They thought it might be a little bit too powerful. Right? So just a reminder, because I don't know about you, but when you were in elementary or middle school, you never really heard that anyone didn't like the Constitution, right? We're all like, yay, Constitution. And there's nothing wrong with being yay, Constitution, right? It's worked for us for a while, right? Despite its flaws, right? But there were concerns. And like we said, Brutus is another document that you should know by now. And Brutus was an anti-federalist. Brutus wrote why they didn't think the states should ratify the Constitution. So Brutus, of course, being not the author's real name, based off of the ancient Brutus. But if you want to think, does anyone even know the Brutus of Popeye? Do you guys even know Popeye cartoon? Is that before your time? Yeah. So Brutus was always after Popeye, but did Popeye always win? Yes, the Constitution was ratified. All right. So a key component to the Constitution, which we mentioned briefly a minute ago, is federalism. You're going to keep understanding federalism more and more as the year goes on. But just know the basic idea, right, that it's that you have this central government and these state governments, and how does it work? Okay. So concurrent powers are that both the state and the central government have powers. And sometimes they overlap in certain things, right? Simultaneously, right, they exercise their power over certain things. Federalism and the power of the central government has also expanded over time. We see that a lot with different things like the Commerce Clause. I'll talk to you about that in a second. But also with federalism, you have multiple points of access. That means multiple ways and opportunities that you as individuals can actually interact with your government, right? Whether it's writing legislatures on the state level or even lower, or on the federal level, and not just writing them, but actually taking part in certain things. Right. So a little side note, the Commerce Clause, another clause in the Constitution that does deal with trade, and it gives remember, Congress has the power of the purse, right? That's their big power. But it's one way that it's expanded federal powers, right? We're going to learn this when we look at the case US v. Lopez, right? When The Congress was like, oh, because of the Commerce Clause, we can make drug-free gun zones. And eventually the Supreme Court is like, we don't want guns around schools, but that has nothing to do with the Commerce Clause. We'll learn about why they thought it did. But every year, when we look at these Supreme Court cases, maybe the ones that are going on today, we'll see, deal with the Commerce Clause. Last year, the Supreme Court dealt with the Commerce Clause and pig farmers in California. If they had to pay certain taxes, was it not fair? Because other states didn't have that, and it was unfair to the California farmers, right? So the Commerce Clause has expanded federalism. We did a little bit about funding, right? Know the different types of grants, but there's categorical grants and block grants. Block grants, here's your money. Do what you need to do with it, right? An unfunded mandate, a mandate is when you tell a state, hey, you have to do something, but we're not going to give you the money to do it. You think that's going to be done as effectively? You think they're going to jump to their feet and do it? Not always. But sometimes what happens is they'll be like, well, if you don't do it, we're not going to give you money for X, Y, or Z. All right, so we'll see more examples throughout the year as that happens. Federalist 10 is one of the documents we spent a little bit of time on. We're going to keep spending more time on it. B-Days will spend some time on it tomorrow. Know it's a Federalist paper so that it's supporting, right, why the states, New York and others, should ratify the Constitution. This one written by our friend Jemmy Madison. And there's a few important points of this. Factions. What is the quote? Heirs to liberty is, oh gosh, what is it?
Liberty is to factions and heirs to fire.
There we go. Liberty is to factions, heirs to fire. Thank you. Right? The idea that you can't get rid of factions, right? Factions are groups that have opinions or agendas, and we use the word faction sometimes, I don't think the way Madison originally intended it to. It's not just a political party, it's not just a faction, but a faction, usually because of their goal, it can oppress another group's in some way, right? So the Girl Scouts selling cookies is a group, a very specific group, but they're not really a faction unless they're actually like, are they oppressing the Boy Scouts? Maybe you can say you're oppressing people who don't want diabetes or something. You know what I mean? Right? But can you get rid of factions? It's about impossible. It's like telling people that Madison points out, you can't make people get rid of their opinions in a free country. So what we can do instead, because factions are natural, we can just do things to try to combat their effects, to try to combat their negative consequences. And one solution to the problem of factions, Madison believed, was to enlarge the republic, to enlarge the country, right? Back then, we did not go to the West Coast, but we're still pretty big if you think about it for those days. We're still bigger than, most of the countries in Europe at that time when we put the 13 states together, right? And the idea is that as the country grows and as people are diverse, you got farmers here, shipbuilders, merchants, and artisans here, right? There's going to be different interests. And because of that, the more people there are, the more diverse those interests are, and there's less likely that one group can then oppress all of them. So the bigger, the better, which was the opposite of Montesquieu, right? Montesquieu was like, hey, republics are best for like smaller, moderate, size countries. Brutus agreed with that. Brutus thought we'd be too big and it would be a problem, right? This is before the time of, now with technology and communications and transportation being changed, this ideology may have changed a little bit. But that's the main idea there. So I wanted to go over three, if I can find it, three of the questions. I thought I had it open already, but it may have closed out. three of the questions that you guys did as you reviewed for this. So give me 1 second. You are 2B. Oops. Oh, no. Let's try this. Remember, this wasn't an assignment, so the grades here are irrelevant. This was just for you to review. So let's go over which ones do I want to do. So this one here, oops. Don't worry about the grades because it wasn't a real grade, so it's irrelevant. All right. So if you look at this question here, which of the following best characterizes the general argument made in Brutus 1? So right away, you know, Brutus, anti-federalist, against the Constitution, right? So before you even look at the answers, that should be what's going through your head. So A says a large republic would be preferable to a small one because more people could participate. That might be what Madison thought, but you know that Brutus didn't agree with Madison. B, a small republic would pose more danger to individual than a large republic. No, because that's what, once again, what Madison thought. So you know that can't be Brutus. Skip down to D, a small republic is more susceptible to corruption. Brutus wants a small republic, so no, right? A large republic is dangerous to personal liberty and undermines the states. Undermining the state, bing, 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 that's a big argument of anti-federalists. Everything about the Constitution undermines the states. All right, does that make more sense now? All right, let's go to, who did this one? Okay. Now this question dealt with segregation, which we're going to learn more about when we do the unit on civil rights. But it's still good exposure now with this unit. So it says, in the 50s, Southern states attempted to prevent integration, right? Schools were segregated by race and they won't, of their public schools. In return, the National Guard, did you guys know this? Right? When we talk about this later, the National Guard was sent to force states to implement federal regulations, right? The federal government says they have to integrate. Some states are saying, no, we're not going to. Make us. So they sent the National Guard in to make them integrate, right? So you see here an issue with federalism, states and the central government at odds with each other. The scenario illustrates which of the following about the relationships between state and national government. And you see here the answer being the debate over the role of the central government and states is ongoing. That's a huge theme all year long. The framers of the Constitution had an issue with balancing state and central governments. The anti-federalists did not like how much state power was given up, and some didn't want to ratify it. And to this day, we look at Supreme Court cases, right? We're going to see which one is it. When we saw that Dobbs was overturned Roe v. Wade, and the Supreme Court said, hey, let states decide. That's an issue of federalism. Should that be up to the states? Or the some things that the central government should say, like, this is how it is, right? It's ongoing, right? And that's just an example of that. And we're going to do one more. Which one was it? Here we go. Nope, that wasn't it. Oh, electoral college. Here we go. In order to appease Federalists and Anti-Federalists, it was agreed at the Constitutional Convention that a group of delegates would be charged with selecting the president, right? Everything that be put in the Constitution was debated and people had different opinions on it. So how do we choose our president was one of them. So this would ensure that. And I remember talking about this with some of you. The president would be chosen directly by the people to ensure that the process adheres to the principles of democracy. Pretty soon you'll be voting for president. Not this round, but the next round, right? I'll be voting for president next year. But am I directly voting for the president? No. We like to think we are, right? But who directly votes for the president? Right? We have the Electoral College. And that's supposed to be basically a check against the people, right? So we vote for our electors who we hope are going to cast their vote. And they normally do, as we choose. B, the president will be chosen by Congress since Congress has been elected and represents the will of the people. That's not a thing. Congress does not choose the president, right? It can go to the House if there's a tie and all that kind of stuff, but generally speaking, it doesn't. D, the president will be chosen by the Supreme Court because the court is charged with making unbiased decisions. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine if the Supreme Court? Because the Supreme Court's not supposed to be political. You can argue if it is or not, but it's not supposed to be. And we like to think that the Supreme Court makes unbiased decisions, but that's a whole nother discussion. Okay, so the idea is a qualified person, representative of the people, would become president. Right? The hope is that the people can still exercise their influence through the Electoral College, but the Electoral College could always sort of have the final say if they think that people are choosing someone that's not qualified. Can you imagine if if electors said, you voted for this, but you guys are stupid, we're picking for someone else instead? Can you imagine? But that's how it's sort of in place. All right. I'll go over with any other questions. If there's other ones, we can go over in our class. But those are the three biggest ones that I wanted to make sure. Right? Any questions on this? Okay. So I'm going to close out this video.